Hello, welcome to the 15th episode of the Unifying Force. I'm Kat, joined by Dave and Gio. How is everybody?
Good morning, doing well.
So, as the title says, we're going to discuss today whether Anakin is even a useful or necessary character in his own story, excluding the fact that he's the father of Luke and Leia, and the sequel trilogy notwithstanding, obviously, because we know they didn't plan that out or anything, and obviously he didn't know that Palpatine had a resurrection plan, or that there was a whole Sith cult in Exegol, but that obviously doesn't count. So, regarding at least the first 6 movies, do we think that Anakin is even a necessary player in his own story? Gio, what do you think?
Yes, absolutely. I think that if we just go by what we see on screen, we can talk about George Lucas's original intentions aside. He's a central character who, through a key moment in his life, takes an alternative pathway to what was initially expected of him. But he's instrumental in bringing about significant change in his life, in those around him, and in the wider Republic, Empire, and galaxy as a whole. Although it's really fun to see to what extent his choices impacted those around him, and that's what we're going to be discussing now today.
Dave?
So, and I'm not doing this just for the sake of controversy. I'm going to go, it could have gotten by without him. Everything, I don't know, being labeled as the chosen one, was he the chosen one? Yes, he was birthed by the Force, but would the Force have not created someone else if Anakin had not existed? What would have been if the Force had just created Luke, or created Luke and Leia, and that been it? It seems, and we'll talk about more specific examples as the show goes on, everything Anakin did, he kind of was undone, or everything that Anakin did could have been done just as easily by others. So I don't know that he himself was necessary.
Yeah, it's interesting because on the one hand, yes, Anakin has an impact on other characters and their own journeys, but as it relates to him being the chosen one, that's almost like a title that's superfluous, because him having a high midichlorian count doesn't really mean anything. And it's more like other characters putting stock in the idea of him being the chosen one allows certain things to play out the way that they do. Like, that's why the Jedi take the wait and see approach with Darth Sidious, which they even mention in episode 3 when they're on when Yoda, Obi-Wan, and Mace Windu are on the gunship on their way to drop off Yoda to go to Kashyyyk, and they're getting all nervous about Anakin spending too much time with Palpatine, and then they specifically bring up the prophecy. And it's like, okay, so that's what you're really leaning on here and hoping that that's somehow going to save you. But Anakin, as you said, he's not really a function of that. He's kind of there because there's like a lot of friction with the Jedi Order with him, as we know, throughout the whole prequel trilogy. And obviously he's not needed to lead the march of the 501st on the Jedi Temple. The fact that Star Wars Rebels introduced the Inquisitors, showing that Vader isn't really the only one out there hunting Jedi. Surprisingly, they didn't really dive into Vader hunting the Jedi in that series so much as just the Inquisitors. And then in the original trilogy, yeah, he nearly killed Luke and prevented him from destroying the Death Star, nearly. And yes, Luke keeps him distracted on the second Death Star, and he kills Palpatine, but there is an argument to be made that if he didn't do that, Wedge and Lando were going to blow up the Death Star anyway, since Luke was there as a diversion. So maybe if Luke wasn't there, Vader would have been in his TIE fighter trying to stop the Millennium Falcon. Maybe he would have succeeded because he's a really great pilot and has already seen the Falcon get the one up on him once. But it's interesting because while he goes on a radical character arc, it's kind of, it's like, does he have an, I guess he kind of influences Obi-Wan's decisions to save his kids in episode 3, because Obi-Wan does go out of his way to save Padme and make sure that the twins are safe. And yes, Leia is integral to the Rebel Alliance, but that's not really related to the prophecy. As far as the demise of the Sith, I would say that, I mean, yes, Palpatine wraps Anakin around his finger, but I mean, Clone Wars notwithstanding, because even though there's a lot of individual things that he does there, in the Skywalker saga itself, it feels like Anakin doesn't really get to do that much to have a major, until he has impacts on other characters, but as it relates to the prophecy and what that was specifically about is destroying the Sith. It's like, yes, he does destroy the Sith, even though, again, simultaneously the Death Star is about to blow up anyway.
Right.
And so I kind of feel almost like he does have a major effect on other things which we're seeing currently in Star Wars. Like his whole plan to trap Luke at Cloud City, as we know, had a huge ripple effect with the War of the Bounty Hunters, and how that is has a ripple effect through to The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett. But as it relates to his own specific story, it doesn't seem like he is a major player. It's like more like how other characters are responding to him or using him.
Yeah, and I mean, like you were getting in there, I think it's really kind of point counterpoint. People will say, or you can say, well, he did this behind me here. Okay, Anakin killed Dooku. He, killed the apprentice of the Emperor. Well, then he became the apprentice of the Emperor. So, if Anakin hadn't been, if they hadn't gone and the Force willed Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan to find Anakin on Tatooine, then Maul wouldn't have been killed. Well, not killed, put out of commission for a time. Then would Maul still be the Emperor's right-hand henchman? Kind of, would he still be doing that kind of heavy lifting that Vader ultimately ended up doing? I'm sure there are other examples.
Yeah, there are. It is very much a kind of tit for tat, as you say, point and counterpoint structure that Anakin in the saga is shown to go through. I guess the biggest, and perhaps this is a way of addressing the kind of concept of balance of the Force, because as we see a character react to something from his choice, I'm trying not to jump too far into the Clone Wars here, but in terms of the saga, Anakin pursuing Padme, it's a carry on from his childhood self, that he fell in love with this beautiful girl, and he, through the events of the saga, as things line up, he continues to pursue that part of his life, which comes into opposition with his commitment to the Jedi Order. It seems that Anakin is a kind of fulcrum and a central source of friction between different established parts of the galaxy and the saga as we know it, whether it's the formal Jedi Order itself and his individual wish to live his life freely, which comes about from the fact that he was a childhood slave on Tatooine. And again, his very instinct was, through his prophetic dreams in the Force and through his, I guess, ambition as a bright young individual, was to break free of those constraints. So I guess it comes down to whether or not we see Anakin as the center point of the story as far as the prequels go, or is he a significant player alongside those that we know, Padme Amidala, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then on the opposing side, the Trade Federation, the Separatists, and then kind of mounting towards that ultimate great revenge plan of the Sith through Sidious Palpatine. I can definitely see in some ways how he can also almost be looked at as an instrument, a tool for whoever's kind of in command from influencing events to go a certain way, whether it's Yoda and Mace, in a way guiding him, but in another way, as Catherine mentioned, in a very hands-off way, almost expecting him to bring about something of his own volition, whereas I guess as we're beginning to discuss it a little more, I do see how he's more of a reactive rather than proactive character. And as events spiral around him and they lean away from his individual wish, whether it's, to go back and free his family and Shmi Skywalker, to pursue the romance with Padme, or to, become the poster boy for the galaxy in the Clone Wars, whenever he encounters opposition, it's as if he wants to really fight against that and break free of that. And I guess it can be looked at as a kind of microcosm of the wider conflict and the basis of the Star Wars, whether it's the Confederacy breaking out against the constraints of the Republic, or the Rebel Alliance then wanting to liberate themselves in the galaxy from the clutches of the Empire. So perhaps we can look at Anakin as a symbolic character, central to the themes of conflict and opposition, of liberation against control and imperialism. But does that take away from his character as an individual, as a relatable human? Perhaps it does, because you could almost see him as almost a narrative device used, rather than just a believable kind of rounded human. And that's what we get a lot more from anytime we're allowed to dive into his thoughts. And that's seen really well in the Clone Wars, where you have a more developed picture of him, because we're just able to get his side of the story, rather than just events going on a wider scale and then suddenly it zooming into a particular flashpoint of his life.
And while we're at a little break there, is I see a bunch of you watching. We've got viewers here on YouTube and on Facebook. Comment, let us know your thoughts. This isn't intended to be a one-way discussion. We want to know what your thoughts on it. Tell us, you agree, tell us you disagree, tell us we're full of crap. Come on. Was Anakin really necessary? Like Gio says, all of this is kind of revolving around him as the central ideal. But was that necessary? Would there have been someone else in that position if not?
Well, Mike, you could tell from, say, in episode 3, Dooku's reaction to Palpatine betraying him is so shocked that if Anakin wasn't there, Palpatine could have killed him easily. Just, he wouldn't have seen it coming. Likewise, Palpatine feigns weakness in his fight with Mace Windu because he wants Anakin to make that choice. Otherwise, judging from how quickly he took out the other 3 or 4 Jedi who came with him, he could have probably dispatched Mace Windu pretty easily as well. And I wonder if they had actually planned this whole thing from the beginning, if Anakin would have been more of a proactive character, because he is very reactive. Like even in episode 2, he's not happy about having to go on this mission to protect Padme as opposed to going on the hunt for Jango Fett. And even when they get to Tatooine, it's they see that there's a message on the ship and they turn it on, and Obi-Wan tells R2, he knows R2 is with Anakin, so he tells him to connect it, and R2 does that by himself. And Padme is the one who insists that they should go try and save him. Whereas he's the one on Geonosis who insists on abandoning the hunt for Dooku to go save Padme. And it's like, okay, so I get it. You're reactive, you're young kind of thing. In episode 3, yes, I think it's critical that he saves Obi-Wan Kenobi from the invisible hand rather than leaving him there to die like Palpatine wanted to. Because that obviously has a major ripple effect on how Luke's story plays out. Because if Obi-Wan's not there, then Luke's just going to be a farmer for the rest of his life. But again, it's almost like he's helping things for other people, as opposed to him kind of really being a major mover in his own story. And part of that is because he's supposed to be, we're seeing him as like the manipulated person, and that's part of why he's like a tragic hero. But I mean, from a fairy tale perspective, yes, he fulfills the prophecy because he kills Palpatine and all that. But when you strip away the fairy tale and look at the actual, like everything in context, then you can see that, okay, he's there, but he's not really as, like Luke Skywalker, for instance, I feel is more of a proponent of his own story and the trajectory that it takes because of all the decisions that he makes in the first film, the second one, and the third one, as opposed to Anakin in the prequels. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that by definition of being a prequel, there's so much extra stuff you have to explain. There's such a big checklist of things that it's like, okay, how are we going to fit all this in here? And it becomes a bit overwhelming, and certain things might have gotten lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, I mean, now I'll argue some of those things too. Is whether was he necessary, or was even Obi-Wan necessary in the story of Luke to be his mentor? Would someone else have filled that role? Maybe there are other Jedi still around. Would Yoda have sought him out? Would Ahsoka have found him? Essentially, Ahsoka. But then again, Ahsoka maybe not, because would Ahsoka care about Luke without her history with Anakin / Vader? Don't know. But yeah, you're right. Is it seems like more of Anakin's decisions were made for him, even though we're saying he's reactive, but we're always in the Clone Wars. He's always jumping out, and he's the first to go and do something. But those, I don't know how to explain that those are still reactive decisions as opposed to proactive, is going out. I've got to be the first one there, but I'm only the first one there after I hear that something's going on. It's not a path to begin with. It's like, oh, this happened, gotta go deal with that. Oh, this happened, gotta go deal with that. And the first one to just kind of rush in headlong, it's not more of a decision as it is, let's rush in headlong to everything. And oftentimes, all of these things, all of these defeats, all of these great victories that we're like, okay, this couldn't have happened without Anakin, but it's, there could have been something else that happened. Anakin essentially sets up the rule of the Sith, the rule of Palpatine, but was he necessary to do that? He's supposed to prevent the Sith. That's the prophecy, but he ends up creating it.
Well, the prophecy was to bring balance to the Force, and the Jedi just falsely perceived that to mean that, I mean, yes, at the end of the day, it does ultimately mean that the Sith will fall, but just not in the manner that the Jedi believed.
Well, actually, thinking of that I just thought that, does it mean that ultimately the Sith will fall? Because the Sith aren't a factor at the point they're talking about the prophecy. It kind of, I think the prophecy may have been misinterpreted, and bringing balance to the Force kind of means the Jedi will fall because they are in control of the universe at that point.
Well, in a way, yes, but I feel that the Jedi's role is more, they're very political, but the Sith are the ones who seem to be seeking to control like the space-time continuum if they could have their way with it, like Palpatine tries. Whereas I don't think the Jedi, like if the Jedi in a normal scenario were presented with the world between worlds in peacetime, I don't think they would tamper with it. I think they'd try and lock that down and let's leave it alone. Whereas Palpatine, being a Sith, he wants control of absolutely everything, and that would really mess things up in terms of balance.
Yeah, I think it's the Jedi, maybe in principle, are meant to be a neutral, natural order of things, but as we see, they end up becoming a sort of political opponent of, the separatists, the Sith, a lot earlier in the timeline. But the sort of default position of the Force is to be one that is a time of peace and a time of compassion and freedom. And the Sith were looking to again, just to upend that. And yeah, if they had control, it's a good way of putting it, that they want to control absolutely everything, the space-time continuum. I think the idea of Palpatine in Rebels interfering with events through the world between worlds and looking to manipulate that is just a sign of how great their greed is, and how all-consuming that kind of lust for power can be if one allows it to overtake them. It's kind of all raging ego and control, and looking to influence things for personal gain, and in a wider sense, political gain. The Jedi, we can say through the prequels, we see one of the key reasons they fall is because they get suckered into this kind of chess piece type exchange with the central conflict of the galaxy, and they end up becoming generals and soldiers when they are in principle meant to be guardians, custodians of peace, and not necessarily antagonists in the galaxy. So but yeah, the fun thing is to look at these what if scenarios and see, if we, it's a bit like almost taking a Jenga piece out though in the center, because if one thing changes, then a whole lot of ripple effect decisions, as Catherine said, we can really spiral out of control. We look at if Anakin chose not to go with the Jedi. Let's say he wasn't somebody who had these grand dreams, whether they were through the Force or through the power of his imagination. Had he stayed on Tatooine, then would even the Clone Wars have come about? Because they came about due to his again passive impact on Obi-Wan and Anakin, but the need to protect him as a potential chosen one, where Qui-Gon was so convinced that he was, ended up bringing Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon into direct conflict with Darth Maul and with the Sith. And then that mystery of the Sith that had been hidden for so long, that was now being brought into the open, was a key factor in the Jedi realizing they need to take a more aggressive stance in their way of protecting the galaxy as they saw it. So yeah, there are so many different ways that we can play this, but I think Anakin's choices, even when looked at as somebody who's manipulated and somebody who is coerced, he's still very much somebody who does follow his internal passions, his emotions, whether that's Jedi or Sith. Doesn't really matter so much in this sense, because they are decisions that come about due to events around him. And again, it's his hunger for controlling events and keeping them just according to his own will that bring about some of the most destructive elements that we see later on in the Republic, and set out the very foundations of the Empire. So yeah, it's there are so many different angles we can look at this from, but it is fun to kind of hypothesize and think, what if a single choice had been made differently on Anakin's part, how much of an impact on the wider galaxy would that have had around him, aside from the very key moments in Revenge of the Sith where he makes his choice to go over from one essential side to the other.
Well, let me hit you with your own Jenga analogy. Okay, if you're in a game of Jenga and you're playing it, if you remove the central piece right there in the middle, nothing happens. You can just take that one right there that everybody is going around, boop, pop it out, throw it away, done. Nothing. It does not affect the game. But anyway, a couple of comments from Bryce in the chat here is Bryce says a lot of why Anakin's reactionary being in the Clone Wars and stuff is he thinks maybe the Jedi Council was trying to limit Anakin's exposure to the dark side. For fear that he would turn, because Yoda sensed much fear in him from the beginning. Are they purposely keeping him on the outskirts and the fringes, not knowing that Palpatine's pulling those strings on that? And he's also saying that agrees that Anakin was forced down the path but moving forward beyond, and we can move beyond the OT and the prequels even, because there are references in other materials to Anakin and Vader. That remember what Ahsoka says in The Mandalorian, that she has seen even the best of the Jedi fall. I presumably is referring to Anakin. Then that's why she wouldn't train Grogu, and that's Anakin again being essential to Ahsoka's story and what we're going to see in the Ahsoka show, what we're seeing in the Mandalorian as well. So even longer lasting impacts beyond his lifetime.
Right, but that's effects on other characters that he's interacting with. It's like he kind of, it helps them on their journeys, but it's like it seems, as far as being proactive, doesn't get to do as much. Like, for instance, in Phantom Menace, while he doesn't really have a protagonist journey, it seems more or less that Qui-Gon's your main character. And when he goes to Watto's shop, he has no problem trying to use a mind trick to basically steal this hyperdrive, because even when Watto tells him your money's no good here, he doesn't care. He's just going to use it anyway, or use the mind trick anyway, because they're doing something that's far more important than haggling over money. And he changes his mind about that when he meets Anakin, because he starts getting suspicious. Like, there's something up with this kid. And once he sees his midichlorian count, he makes a decision that, okay, rather than pull whatever scam he was probably going to pull to try and get that hyperdrive, because he knew they needed to get back and save the people of Naboo and all that, he's like, no, I'm going to shift gears and focus on this kid and see if my suspicions are correct. And he ultimately believes that it is, and chooses to start like mentoring him and taking him along the way, which takes up the whole entire middle portion of that film. And it's him making the proactive decision to do that, instead of, going off and, sneaking back there in the middle of the night with Captain Panaka and Obi-Wan and just, stealing the hyperdrive and taking up. And yes, Anakin makes the choice ultimately to leave his mother, which I think is one of the most proactive decisions he makes in the whole trilogy. Because if he didn't leave, I don't think Qui-Gon would have dragged him kicking and screaming. Who knows if the Force would have tried to manipulate things to make sure he went anyway. But that's like an instance where you have a character in Qui-Gon who puts the story on hold because he makes a choice that I'm going to do this to see what effect that it's going to have. Whereas with Anakin, I think it's also because of all the other things going on in the plot. Yes, he has an effect on other characters, like you said with Ahsoka, most certainly. And that especially reverberates in Mandalorian, because I take it that even though Grogu has gone off of Luke at this point in the Mandalorian timeline, that we're going to see him again at some point, and not just for the sake of a cute cameo. I think he's going to have some bearing on the future of Star Wars history in some way. And Ahsoka's decision not to train him because of what happened to Anakin is going to be probably have been an integral moment for that character, which is again a ripple effect of things that happened to Anakin and other people observing Anakin and what became of him. Because Ahsoka always talks about how, oh, she's just like her master, and Obi-Wan even critiques that and how he's frustrated that she copies too much of what he's doing. So you can see that as having a major effect. But unfortunately, Ahsoka was not really part of the Skywalker saga or the whole Chosen One prophecy, and that she only brought it up, I think, jokingly at times in the Clone Wars. She didn't really put much stock in that idea either. So it's, I guess that in a way is what makes him tragic, is that he's in a way helping shape all these other people's journeys, even though he's not able to control his own.
So what about the other part of that, as where he was saying, was the Jedi Council purposely limiting it? Is the reason why that happened is because the Council was limiting him? Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we could see that he definitely has a lot of friction in his relationship with like Mace Windu, who really doesn't like him. And they play that up a lot more in the Clone Wars than in the films. But in the films they do as well. When Anakin tells Mace Windu about Palpatine, like, he's a Sith Lord, and he's like, I want to come with you. And he very sternly says, no, you stay here. And if what you've told me is true, you will have gained my trust. And it's like, geez, you're 3 years into this kid's been here at the temple for 13 years. You're 3 years into this war. He's the best general you have, and you still don't trust him, which shows, I think that does validate everything you're saying there, Dave, because they like when they'll put him on the council to satisfy Palpatine's desire to have somebody on the council, but we're not going to grant you the rank of master, even though he's probably clearly at this point achieved. I mean, if Obi-Wan only had to beat Darth Maul to get promoted from a Jedi Padawan to a Jedi Knight, and being able to graduate from having a master and not getting assigned a new master, then you would think that the sheer amount of stuff that Anakin's done as a Jedi Knight in the Clone Wars would have been more than sufficient to promote him to master status. But they're like, no, you know. And I admit that would have been neat if that kind of played into Anakin's decision making on what his decision to not save Mace Windu when he had the opportunity to. Like the fact that he doesn't like him or have a lot of friction there. And who knows, maybe when you watch Clone Wars, you could imagine that in your head as adding an extra layer to it. But so that's yeah, I think you're right. They're definitely deliberately keeping him on the periphery.
What do you
it does
think,
seem
Joe?
like it does seem like it's out of a misguided fear of this unknown quantity they have within him. He is a superpower, somebody who can bring about great change, if that's the prophecy that they feel. But I guess because the prophecy is so vague, there's so much so diffuse in saying to bring balance to the Force. They don't know how. You know, who knows how many, if this prophecy is something that has been in total isolation from other aspects of the Jedi through time, but there's so much that they don't know about it that it seems they're handcuffed by their own fear of perhaps moving this key central pawn in this game of chess against the dark side onto the wrong square, and how that could have really negative influence on chains of events. They're not certain of when to use this. I mean, they're benching their best player at the most critical moments, and it's, you know, it goes very much against what you'd think is the logical and wise choice from the Jedi to not use something. But then again, is the fact that the Jedi don't use Anakin as a tool, as a weapon, a sign of again Anakin being instrumental in the effects on others, but a key differentiator from the Sith, the dark side, and Palpatine. They're not as willing to manipulate him in an overt way to bring about and change events because they're unsure of him, because they haven't had such a long exposure to him. And Palpatine is very quick to jump on the chosen one bandwagon and see, okay, well, if this significant person who can be weaponized to his will can be used to see things from my perspective, or you know, if I can just sow enough seeds of doubt, again, the uncertainty kicks in. Palpatine uses the uncertainty of the Jedi to sow seeds of distrust within Anakin that begin to fester and eventually grow and bloom into the cataclysm of Revenge of the Sith. And the Jedi, were they unwise to not do that, to leave Anakin as a passive onlooker to events and simply you know, an enforcer from their side in the war, rather than as a central figure who can actually make leadership decisions. He wanted to be on the council. He was refused multiple times, and that was another example of how he didn't deal very well with conflict. He didn't deal very well with not getting his way. So it's kind of a two-way street. Does he have the volition to want to make change? Yes, but is he constantly overridden and undermined by his desires and the actions of those around him? Yes, he is, time and again. And those were really the aspects that saw him finally pull away from the Jedi Order and try something in philosophical terms entirely on the opposite side to where he had started from.
So we've been talking a lot about Anakin's influence or not influence of the story as Anakin Skywalker. What about what he's done as Darth Vader? You know, that's the whole other thing. Would those things affect the storyline? And I mean, I'll start with, well, Darth Vader kills the Emperor. He kills Emperor Palpatine. He ends, you know, the original trilogy. That's over. The Sith are defeated. But wait, somehow Palpatine returned. And so that's where you don't get to if you throw out the sequel trilogy, okay, yeah, there's a major point right there that he did that. He did it, that happened, he did it to
Right.
save his son, overthrew, end of argument. But somehow Palpatine returned. So if the sequel trilogy is in there, that totally nullifies the effects of what went down there.
Well, I would say that the movie where Vader slash Anakin has the most effect on everything and is the biggest driver of events is The Empire Strikes Back, because in the opening crawl of that movie, it says that Vader's plan is, not to crush the rebellion, it's to find Luke. And because he wants to find this pilot, he's obsessed with it. And in the Marvel Comics, the Darth Vader series, they revealed that he found out that Luke was his son shortly after the events of A New Hope, which makes sense because he's obviously he was so curious as to who this rebel was that he'd want to find that out. But in this movie, he's on this quest to specifically, he wants Luke to be in the position that he finds himself in when he chops his hand off in Cloud City. He's geared everything towards this end game. He gets him there, and then Luke makes the decision to kill himself instead of joining Vader, and he's so defeated by that he doesn't even bother trying to use the Force to force grab Luke or anything. He just lets him fall. So, but he is very much steering all of the events of that movie, which of course will have a major ripple effect in The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, because the single decision to let Boba Fett take Han Solo, which is such a blasé thing, yeah, sure, whatever, it ends up leading to the fall of the Hutt cartel, which paves the way for Boba Fett to come and take the throne as he has in this upcoming series. But that movie, I feel Empire is where he is a driving force of everything, because he keeps the Falcon, hunting down the Falcon all the way through the movie. He coordinated the Battle of Hoth and setting the trap at Cloud City. It's just that it doesn't go the way he wanted it to, even though it does inadvertently cause Luke to learn all of the lessons that he wasn't learning on Dagobah by beating him in combat at the end there, which does have an influence in how Luke is able to then, destroy the Hutt cartel and bring Vader back to the dark side, or back to the light side, which in a way it's like Vader in that sense became an instrument of his own redemption, whether he meant to or not.
Yeah, I would agree definitely that in The Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader is not just an agent of evil and a figurehead of this dark and oppressive force that is the Empire, but that he is a figure of pathos that we feel right at the end when, of course, that decision that Luke makes, the revelation from Darth Vader to Luke, completely recontextualizes everything that you've seen and thought of perhaps about Darth Vader up until that point. Now, of course, that came about as a huge surprise, as a revelation. But the fact that there's this kind of dual identity within the Darth Vader character, that he was this former person of apparent virtue and a very different character to what we see, and Luke and the audience, us as viewers, are presented with, makes him a much more complex villain, and also a blueprint for I guess the villains that are explored throughout the saga, and in various ways they reflect elements of Anakin's collapse as a reasonable human, and somebody who had some compassionate and loving qualities, to a person who's full of self-loathing, hatred, jealousy, and then also physically has transformed from a human to a cyborgian android type warrior. We see in Darth Maul. Darth Maul had his literal great fall, but he was somebody who was all raw emotion and all raw anger, and you see those elements as Darth Vader. I think they're really well choreographed in the duel with Luke. You see him really lashing out, and finally, once he receives a few blows from Luke Skywalker's blade, he doesn't hold back. It's as if he's been toying with Luke Skywalker the entire duel and looking to draw out these qualities of the dark side from Luke, and then lets his true feeling, his true emotion get the better of him, You see Count Dooku was a Jedi who saw political differences and also philosophical differences with the way the Jedi Order had been acting, and that's reflected in obviously in Anakin's choice to go over to the dark side. But looking specifically more at the original trilogy, we didn't have so much screen time with Darth Vader, but the fact that he was somebody who brought about the kind of linchpin within the two of the original saga. So in Revenge of the Sith, it's his he bookends the idea of bringing balance to the Force by completing the end result of the prophecy, if not, well, we're saying the prophecy as a direct action in throwing Palpatine down and killing him, slaying the overall supervillain of the series, and also bringing about completion to his own story, and saving Luke. He doesn't have such a presence emotionally until really, I guess, the Return of the Jedi, and you see him in the throne room beginning to with Luke really trying to draw that humanity and that original sense of self back out from Darth Vader. I think it's fascinating how you can look at that. I guess in some sense, Darth Vader was a transformation of the Anakin Skywalker character into not only somebody who'd been making these awful choices, but was a victim of his own dark deeds and of his own selfishness. Or would you see it as Darth Vader, by destroying the Emperor and bringing balance to the Force, does he then go back to becoming Anakin Skywalker? And of course, he doesn't undo the terrible atrocities he's committed, but just kind of thematically, is he then returned to his former self, or is he a greater self, a greater character, by becoming this ultimate this champion?
Yes, let me get it before you give your reaction, Catherine. Is Mike asks, well, what even is this prophecy? Where does it come? Where does this prophecy come from? Do we know? Is it specifically spelled out? Is there a book that contains it? Where is this prophecy from?
I can't remember. It's somewhere in the Legends continuity. It's been struck from the canon, so
officially no, but yes, there is a thing that tells us.
But Anakin, yes, he did return to Anakin, and we know that because we saw him back at his Force Ghost Anakin at the end of Return of the Jedi, and he's one of the Jedi voices in Episode 9 trying to encourage or resurrect Rey or whatever. He should have been the only voice, and he should have been the one to kill Palpatine, showing that Abrams and whoever the co-writer was, Terrio, have no understanding of the Star Wars story. But okay, he's like, he went back to being Anakin, but it's interesting that, again, he doesn't, like, none of the characters in the sequel trilogy really mention him or think of him, or like even Luke in his revelations in The Last Jedi doesn't seem to think about his father. Like, yeah, he kind of mentions it in the sense where he's talking about how the Jedi went in the prequels, but he doesn't mention his father specifically, and none of the characters do, which is weird for the character who's been sort of retroactively made the major protagonist or the major centerpiece of the whole saga. Has no real effect or presence in the last trilogy, which is odd and
hold up little mask.
Yeah, the whole fanboy thing, and yeah, that aspect of it. But it is, and I don't think that when Kylo said that, show me again the power of the darkness, I don't think Anakin or Vader literally showed up to him and showed him anything, unless it was Palpatine doing some weird machinations to trick Kylo into thinking his grandfather was talking to him. Otherwise, I would think it's just Kylo kind of looking to the history books, as it were, like, what did my grandfather do in these decisions? Like, show me again, that kind of thing. It admittedly was a very weird thing that seemed to imply that he was talking to a spirit, but the whole idea of this, I mean, they did flirt with the idea in the pre-production of Episode 7 of having Sith spirits, but then they quickly discarded that because that's like they couldn't become ghosts if they wanted to, because of what it requires, the humility that is required to become a Force ghost in the first place. So Yeah,
And of course,
it would.
Vader wouldn't have a Force ghost, even if he were able to be a Force ghost, because he's not Vader anymore. He turned back to Anakin.
Right.
That's right.
It would have been one thing if Palpatine did not have a resurrection plan and it were a completely different Sith Lord or somebody trying to resurrect the Sith as at large. But since it is Palpatine, since he did have a plan in the works from the beginning, then Anakin, it's like you could say that he succeeded in kicking the can down the road, causing we're going to delay it a little bit longer, but that's not really, it's not getting the football across the goalposts, if it will, or across the end of the end zone. It's like you're getting close, but sorry, we got to stop now. Hand off the baton to the next person.
So let's ask this. We've talked about how obviously in Return of the Jedi and Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader, Anakin, is the driving force of the movie series, of the story, of what's going on. Did the prequel trilogy, the Clone Wars, and the sequel trilogy, just a little bit, but did those other storylines that were presumably all about Anakin Skywalker, are they what really removed his importance? In the original trilogy, we just said, okay, he's the enforcer, it's his plan, he's doing all this stuff in Return or Empire Strikes Back. He's doing all this. He had the big moment by destroying the Emperor in Return of the Jedi. Are all these other stories that are presumably about him what really removed his importance?
Yeah, probably. Now that you phrase it that way, because the whole idea again of him being the tragic character of other people using him for their own ends, whether it's the Jedi or whether it's Palpatine, is kind of what makes him as frustrated as he is in episode 2, because he's tired of other people holding him back and telling him what to do. And you get a hint of that with how Palpatine's trying to be the nice guy, saying, oh, they don't know how powerful you are, Anakin, don't worry. And you get a lot of those moments with them in Clone Wars. But yeah, it's almost like the series, I guess, the prequel trilogy in a sense is trying to make the argument that it's like it's a bunch of like boiling anger and that he's not letting out because too many people are trying to take control of his life. And it's not until he becomes Darth Vader that he's finally able to do certain things, but probably not until the events of Empire Strikes Back, or some of those events are clearly a much more significant driving force of how the end of that saga is going to play out.
Yeah, I find it hard to say anything more than that, really. Yeah, it's very much so that he was we're given a lot more shades of Anakin, shades of his different ways of thinking, shades of his different experiences in the Clone Wars. Not unfortunately as much in the prequel trilogy, but we're glad to have the Clone Wars to give us more time with Anakin to see how as vague as the prophecy of the Chosen One is, we can put our own interpretations and color onto it by just virtue of seeing more of Anakin, seeing his interactions with those around him that he cared for deeply, and then those around him who he saw as obstruction to what he wanted to bring about. There's the arc in the Clone Wars where they go to Zygeria and they encounter a planet that's suffering from slavery, and that very willingness to bring justice and bring forth change is something that it really strikes a massive chord, as we can all understand, emotionally and humanely with him. And I remember that being a key moment where it's very much his anger is boiling and he has to kind of simmer it down, tone it down, and not until later that he can really unleash his all his emotions. And perhaps that's just a lesson in for all of us in how outlets and release of emotion is important for maintaining one's humanity and maintaining a sense of personal peace and balance, whether that's on an individualistic level or as a wider thematic level, to say the individual, if they are going to bring balance to the Force, has to have balance within them. And it is not until far later in the saga that we see the representation of all that was good and virtuous in him through his son is something that brings about his ultimate rebalancing from the imbalance he suffered in the early part of his life. He was on the side of good, of the light side of the Force, but was finding so many conflicts within himself and moments of jealousy and anger. There was again that another arc with the whole Rush Clovis character, and how Anakin was very much sparked into real jealousy and resorted to almost completely brutalizing this guy without the use of his lightsaber because he just couldn't contain his emotions. Another sign of that sort of psychological imbalance within him. Then he goes over to the dark side. He brings about the dark times, the Empire, and he's fully unleashing his anger, his resentment, the jealousy, the all those negative feelings that had been stored up that he'd kind of switched off until he went over to the dark side, and it brought about his own rage, the ruin of everything around him. But he was not able to become that element of a balanced character until the very end, until he'd finally seen what could have been through Luke Skywalker in front of his very burned eyes behind the mask in the throne room, and finally found that sense of peace. And that was the time that his life was then redeemed, not by his actions, but by his personal confrontation with everything that he'd let really spiritually bother him and kind of unhinge him. He was able to bring about a sense of fulfillment by essentially reconciling these two kind of opposing psyches within him, that of Anakin Skywalker and then that of Darth Vader. Anakin was a character of hope that was suppressed until he essentially raged and everything boiled over after having years of it simmering. And then as Darth Vader, it was all volcanic and without bringing about the obvious Mustafar pun there. But yeah, it was very much a life of rage and conquest. And it was bringing those two opposing halves together that at least got him to be a character of final balance, if not the chosen one in question. Because of course you can take the argument that, well, as Dave, you mentioned at the beginning, if Anakin hadn't been the chosen one, would it have just fallen to the destiny of another character in the Force? Would Luke have been brought into the story, not as necessarily the son of Anakin, but as the character who brings about the balance of the Force? We don't know, but it's I guess what I'm saying is psychologically, when the Anakin Skywalker Darth Vader two halves of that sort of whole that was very much fractured through the 6 original saga films, when that was brought about to peace, it brought about a wider contextual peace for the galaxy. And to me, at least, that is one strong factor in saying that Anakin can be considered the chosen one overall.
Well, a couple of questions and comments that kind of relate to what we're talking about here. Mike, I did find while we were talking in Legends, the prophecy of the Chosen One is an ancient Jedi legend, foretold the coming of a powerful, Force-sensitive being who would restore balance to the Force. The prophecy was one of hundreds of obscure legends created by the very first Jedi philosophers after the creation of the Galactic Republic, but before the Jedi assumed an active role in it. And it was recorded on at least one, if not a series of holocrons. And that's how we have that. That's the Legends part of that. And the comments are saying is, Sean says I don't like how Vader just force chokes his men every time they do something wrong, and that. But I think that's, Sean, the overt showing of the decisions that Anakin/Vader makes. The only ones that aren't necessarily reactive are not positive decisions. When he chooses to kill not just the men but the women and the children, that's one of the few examples of, here's a decision I made and it's going down the dark path. The little lieutenant, a commander, mouths off to me in a meeting, oh, I'm just going to squeeze his throat. Decision not necessarily positive. It's just a device to show you how far he's gone. But Mike asked probably what the last question that we're going to really have time for, what you were talking about, Gio, and what we've been referring to. But what if the prophecy of the chosen one was not referring to Anakin? It was referring to Rey. And go.
Possibly, but I mean, you could say that retroactively with trying to reread the interpretation of the entire saga. But it would still be very odd because they obviously didn't put too much thought into that character either. At first, it seemed like they were, because they were making the point that anybody, reminding people that anybody could have the Force. It's not restricted to certain families. But then they cowardly retconned that in the last film. And then it's like, well, she's Palpatine's granddaughter. Oh, but people did the math and realized that that would mean that her father wasn't born until after he became the old decrepit Darth Sidious, and people started making a bunch of not very Disney family friendly jokes about it. So then within a few months, they retconned it again in a comic to say that her dad was like a failed Palpatine clone. It's like, well, how exactly is it a failed clone? I don't know. Which shows just how bad of a job that they did with that last movie. So yeah, you could say that in a sense it's referring to Rey, because she does clearly represent a better form of what the Jedi would be. She has a little bit of the dark and the light, which we saw in the first Jedi Temple and Last Jedi, the yin yang symbol. It's not that you can shut out one side; you have to acknowledge the duality in the Force, which she clearly does. Which I think is one could reason that maybe is the Force willing that Palpatine was able to weasel his way out of death and Return of the Jedi, because Luke would not have been the right person to lead. Like, even though Luke made the right decision in deciding not to do what his mentors wanted him to do, which was to kill his father and kill the Emperor, which is something I've always taken issue with in Return of the Jedi, where Obi-Wan's like, oh, well, I told you he was your father from a certain point of view. Like, no, you didn't. You just didn't want to tell Luke that that Vader was his father, because you wanted him to kill him. Because when Luke told him very specifically, I can't kill my own father, Obi-Wan being a defeatist, he's like, oh, well, then the Emperor's already won. So yes, one could argue that Luke has learned for the better when he throws down his lightsaber that, okay, that's not what the Jedi should be. But because he's still been raised in that same line of thinking, is he going to be the best? In a perfect world, they probably would have ended the Skywalker saga there and said, yes, Luke can be the Zen master that he sort of becomes at a much later point in the expanded universe, in the Legends continuity, I should say. But since they didn't, the way the story goes with Luke kind of makes sense in the sequel trilogy. Or I think it makes a lot of sense. So yes, you could argue that in our little imaginations that they plan all 9 movies out from the start, that yes, Rey being the one to defeat Palpatine at the very end would make sense, because, oh, well, even though there's nothing in the story of Episode 9 to say that Palpatine doesn't have another clone body somewhere else, the fact that she is clearly a much better vessel, if you will, but much better representative of what the Jedi should be, that the Force is now willing to let Palpatine go permanently. It's like, your job is finished here. It's almost like the Force allowed Palpatine to come to power because you needed to get rid of the broken Jedi Order and pave the way for whoever the new person was going to be, which might be Rey. Who knows? Because she didn't really make any declarations as to what she wanted to do with the new Jedi, if there was going to be a new order or what. So that, which is another pitfall, I feel, of that trilogy, because it's like, okay, you have the texts, you buried the lightsabers, the Sith are gone, but well, what are you going to do with it now? Because it almost seems like, almost as if the Force is arguing that we don't want Jedi or Sith. It's like, you got to do something with it.
Well, and it gets a little weird when she proclaims herself as a Skywalker.
Technically she is, because Kylo did infuse his whole life force and his soul into her to bring her back to life.
Yeah.
So in that way, she kind of, in a way,
that's getting a little non-Disney right there. That's oh, but yeah. Mike points out that in Legends, Luke does fall to the dark side, and if we go like deep into Legends, Mike, there's a whole lot of this that what we've just said during this hour goes a completely separate way. Is, we've brought it in and we've mentioned it a little bit, but when you're talking about the old expanded universe and all of that stuff that is now non-canon, Luke and especially and even Anakin. There's so much more that goes on. Is you have to limit and draw the line somewhere. And saying that, I think we're about to draw the line a little bit because we're about out of time. So I'll just roll it over to final thoughts.
Yeah, it's been a fun discussion, and thank you both for facilitating this to happen. I guess for me, the concept of the chosen one, it's so vague, it's so abstract, it's left open for us to decide. George Lucas had his very clear thoughts on it, but perhaps we can look at it as two ways. There's the kind of narrative choices, and then there's the thematic ones. And yeah, there are it's been a good dissection of the importance of Anakin as a character and the importance of his influence on a chain of events. You know, it's that kind of chicken and egg thing. So if he is the chosen one, then he brought about these events further down the line, if not actively taking a part in executing them and producing them himself. Did he just do that through the means of the Force, or was he just an individual who's manipulated? We don't know for sure, but it's maybe a case of the chosen one didn't have to be a specific individual. It could have been a character at a specific snapshot of time. So in the prequel era, it was Anakin, and through the Clone Wars, that sort of chosen one mantle was with him through one fateful, unfortunate decision as a catalyst to wider disruption. He diverted from that pathway, but then he brought about the opportunity for the chosen one to rise again in his son Luke. And we saw that manifest at the end of the original saga. And one can say, if we want to bring the sequel trilogy into it, that Rey thematically completed that loop by being the spiritual successor to the prophecy of destroying the Sith. But then, when does it end? It could keep going on and on.
Yeah, I'm gonna say my final thoughts are, I mean, obviously Anakin Vader was central to the story in George's original vision. I would love to know what George's original concept of, just his little idea that they said he had all along, where did that loop go? But I think when he went down to actually write the prequels and run in the prequels, is he muddied it. And then obviously the sequel trilogy people muddied it even further, and it just spiral his importance out of that is it could have been anything, and the prophecy gets this and that, the throw in little midichlorian tiny organisms influencing all of our lives, and that's where it goes down. Catherine?
Yeah, I think that Vader is definitely Vader in the original trilogy is definitely a more stronger proponent of his journey than Anakin was in the prequels. And as I mentioned earlier, I guess that's kind of, in a sense, the point, that's what made him so angry and sent him down that path. Whereas the sequel trilogy, they screwed it particularly on 7 and 9. But yeah, it's funny because when I saw 9, I said the subtitle for this movie could be from a certain point of view, because if you keep twisting it, you could say that kind of works as a sequel to the last movie, but it really doesn't. And so I don't think they really want to continue those characters' story as much as they keep saying they do. So I just kind of look at it as like, okay, John and Dave are currently trying to make that story in 9 make sense with the Mandalorian, and presumably with whatever's going to happen in the Thrawn series or the Ahsoka series. And the crossover event, I presume, is something they haven't announced yet, which is going to come after that, presumably Thrawn related. So we'll see where that goes. So yeah, I think it also, at the end of the day, it's kind of what happens when you don't have, like, the fact that Lucas didn't plan it from the start. Like, there's a book out now called, like, I think it's called the Star Wars Archives. It's like hundreds of dollars, like this big book that they put out a couple years ago, and it's a very revisionist history, but makes it sound like, oh, this whole thing was planned from the beginning. It's like, no, it wasn't. it's I find it ironic that the trilogy that tends to get the most hate, at least in terms of execution, like the prequel trilogy, because of the the dialogue, the acting, that's the one which actually had the most planning and thought put into it, because George knew where those stories were going to lead and had to make sure all the checklists were there, even though it didn't land with a lot of people, which I thought, whereas the other two trilogies sort of fly by the seat of their pants, to much greater degree, different degrees of financial and pop culture success.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll throw this out there as the chosen one, is you're sitting there going, well, maybe Rey had the light in the dark and made the decisions and this and that. Something for another day. Was Qui-Gon the chosen one? We've talked about that a little bit, but the Gray Jedi, somebody who would make the decisions, had both the light and the dark. We are not going there right now because we're out of our time. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Really great discussions today. Join us next week, same time, same channel, for another episode of the Jedi Archives. I think they're talking about High Republic Adventures number, I think it's 5. I wouldn't swear to that. And definitely join us this week. Some great programming happening on the Virtual Cantina Network. Tomorrow night is the second Monday of the month. We have Celebrating Autographs with Frank D. Rich. Always fun, good stuff to talk about, and start your celebration prep now. We're getting closer. We're getting closer all the time. So con season are definitely going. LA Comic-Con just happened. C2E2 going on like right now. I think it's the last day of that. And all other cons. So join us for Celebrating Autographs. Join us for the Virtual Cantina on Tuesday, and another episode of the Watch-Alongs on Thursday night, getting ready for the countdown to the Book of Boba Fett. All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and have a good Sunday. May the Force be with you.
And the Force be with you.
May the Force be with you all. Thank you, guys.